So that is how meticulously we are talking about transmitting the Quran word for word, letter for letter, ayah for ayah, surah for surah, exactly as he was told.
And frankly, you know, the Quran has been preserved, we believe, since the time of the Prophet till now, word for word, letter for letter, haraka or vowel sign for vowel sign.
Perfect preservation.
Halo sobat-sobat di SINAU, presentasi kita kali ini adalah mengungkap fakta-fakta lama yang jarang diungkapkan dalam sejarah penyusunan Al-Quran. Ya. Nah, dalam presentasi kali ini kita akan mengambil narasumber dari 3 orang pakar kritik teks Al-Quran yang memang cabang kritik teks Al-Quran ini bukan merupakan ilmu yang lama tapi cukup baru karena memang intensitas dari kritik teks terhadap teks-teks Al-Quran memang belum semaju dan sedalam kritik teks Alkitab, baik PL, Perjanjian Lama maupun Perjanjian Baru. Namun, banyak terungkap bahwa fakta yang berbeda dengan klaim-klaim dakwah selama ini yang menyatakan bahwa Al-Quran terjaga dengan sempurna, kemudian sama dari masa Nabi Muhammad sampai sekarang, teksnya pun harakatnya titik nol, dot komanya pun juga sama persis, tidak ada perubahan. Ini merupakan klaim-klaim yang sangat tidak benar dan terbukti bahwa memang dalam sejarahnya penyusunan Al-Quran banyak mengalami revisi, mengalami pengeditan dan juga konsensus, ya, kesepakatan yang akhirnya kita dapatkan Al-Quran, bentuk Al-Quran yang sekarang. Mari kita akan lakukan presentasi ini dan belajar bersama-sama.
Ya, Profesor Shady Naseer, saya mau bertanya, apa yang dimaksud dengan varian atau ragam versi bacaan Al-Quran, dan apakah dengan varian-varian tersebut terdapat versi Al-Quran yang asli?
Sure. Okay, so I think to start with, it's important to talk a little bit about the word variant. I always try to mention that as footnotes in articles, that we used variant in Western scholarship, and it became a custom that we say variants. In the Islamic literature, the word variant doesn't exist. So you only say qira'ah, which is a reading. And I think hopefully one day we will be able to say readings in Western literature without using the word variant. And the reason for that is probably when you are saying variant, you are assuming that there's an origin. Okay. Now, of course, if you want to go the secular path, you would say, well, there must be an origin, and then variants are emerging from this origin. In the case of the Quran, there's no we don't have the sense that Muslim scholars were taught about origin, the majority of them. Okay, so there's no such thing as an ur-text or an original text from which these variants evolved or mutated, except for probably a strand in the Shia tradition where they do contend that there must be an original version or an ur-text, and there's only one qira'ah. There are no such thing as multiple qira'at. Okay, so that's just a clarification for right. The variant. Yeah. Islamic scholarship, the readings are equal, at least what came to be known as the canonical readings or the standard readings. So they are equal in status, they are divine. If you have a word which has 2 or 3 or 4 or even 5 readings, they are all equal in status. So it's either we don't know how the Prophet read them, or we assume that he approved of all these readings, the 3 or 4 or 5 of them. Probably there are some verses with at least 5 or 6 verses or 6 readings canonical in a sense. So that's what a reading is. Now, if you if you are a textual critic and you want to sit with the text and say, well, I think the original reading is this, because this is what Arabic grammar instruct us to read the text. So there's some kind of tension here, if you want, between what the tradition teaches and what textual critic. A textual critic doesn't have to be a Western critic. It could be a grammarian, and all Arab grammarians. There has always been tension between the Quran readers and Arab grammarians, especially the early ones, because many of the early Arabic grammarians, they were rejecting some of the canonical readings because they considered them not to be grammatical. So in a nutshell, a reading or a variant reading, so you have a word, and there are multiple ways of reading it, whether pronouncing it, whether it's a variation of a dialect, whether it's syntactical, the syntactical function is different. Is it a subject? Is it an object? Is it the conjugation of the verb could be different. So is it active? Is it passive? Is it a noun? Is it a verb? So because the early Quranic script, it didn't have a fully developed system of vowels, the flexibility of reading these words gave way to having all these different variant readings, or what we are calling variant readings or qira'at. Yeah.
This is terrific. Okay, so it's actually pretty complicated to sort through, I think, maybe for everyone. I mean,
Pertanyaan kedua, apakah perbedaan varian bacaan Al-Quran tersebut terjadi di kota-kota lain selain Mekah, dan bagaimana sikap umat Islam awal mensikapi adanya perbedaan tersebut? Apakah terdapat versi-versi Al-Quran yang berbeda tetap berkompetisi atau bersirkulasi walaupun setelah kanonisasi Utsman?
Yeah, that's one point that I raised and paid attention to is you have these accounts. Yes, there is some historical value to them. There are different reading traditions in Medina. There were different reading traditions in Medina, okay, and different also masahif, and also in Mecca, let's say the bigger Hijaz. And there were different also codices and copies in Syria, okay, and in Iraq at large. So the point is saying that people were differing in they had differences in reciting the Quran when Hudhayfa is coming to Uthman. There must have been also differences in Medina, because this is what the records show us. Especially that there are certain details about why Hudhayfa came and what he told the caliph. He told Muslim scholars were very aware of the fact that variations in the Quran are going out of control. Even the whole literature of variants of qira'at was one of the tools that people even in the classical literature, that people were attacking Muslim scholars, that, oh, you say that there's only one Quran, what about these variations? And this is why al-Baqillani wrote his book, Intisar al-Quran, is to defend the variant readings,
the victory or the triumph of the Quran.
Triumph, right, of the Quran. These questions, it's not something that we are only asking today. People were asking them 1,000 years ago.
By the way,
I don't want to dismiss the possibility that when Muslim scholars started to have theological discussions about the integrity of the Quran and vis-a-vis the scriptures of Christians and Jews, that what characterizes the Quran is that it's only one and it's not falsified and it's not corrupted. Or in al-Basra, you have Hassan al-Basri, was a great figure also in early Islam. He has a reading and he deviates often from the Uthmanic lesson, and he must have been relying on a copy. And he's early. I mean, so I was saying that it does make sense to entertain the idea that there were competing copies, and they were not only this Mus'haf al-Imam, the main codex that Uthman sent, and everyone was reading from them. There must be copies of copies. Which one was the original Uthmanic copy? That's difficult to answer now, at least.
That's great. Yeah, very interesting.
Pertanyaan selanjutnya adalah bagaimanakah cara Utsman mengkanonisasi varian-varian bacaan yang berbeda-beda tersebut, mengingat klaim-klaim selama ini bahwa Al-Quran dapat secara akurat dilestarikan dengan sebagian besar dari hafalan atau lisan, ya, bukan tulisan. Apakah benar?
It is. And I mean, this is one of the, again, if you want a dichotomy or tension between oral and written transmission in the Islamic tradition. And I think one of the, if you want, the focus on orality or memorization of the text, that because Muslim scholars were aware that the script is defective, and I don't mind using the word defective because it was defective. It took time to develop, like all other scripts in the world, and Muslim scholars themselves call it defective. Why shouldn't we call it defective? Because they knew that the script was not able to capture all different nuances of recitation, okay? And it was not able to accurately capture all the vowels, all the dotting preferences, if you want. They developed this system of what we call oral transmission, in a sense, memorizing the Quran. And the Quran can only be verified through oral means, which is the license or the ijaza from master to student. And you have a whole corpus of literature condemning people who only take their knowledge from books, and condemning people who don't go to teachers and professors to learn from them, and they only pick a book and read from it. Two competing traditions. You have one oral tradition and you have a written tradition. That written tradition wins. So we reached a point where anything that goes against the Uthmanic Codex, even if you have a strong oral transmission from your teacher and from your teacher's teacher, it doesn't matter. What matters at the end of the day is the written codex. So anything that deviates from the Uthmanic Rasm, from the Uthmanic Codex, is rejected by Muslim scholars. It doesn't matter who transmits.
Pertanyaan selanjutnya, apakah yang dimaksud dengan sabat ahruf atau 7 ahruf? Karena dalam hadis tersebut disebutkan bahwa Al-Quran diturunkan dalam 7 ahruf yang berbeda-beda.
I mean, from my perspective, it's the easy answer. There's no easy answer. I'm trying to make it easy. Is that this hadith about sabat ahruf, it exists only to give legitimacy to the qira'at, to the reading traditions. That's all about it. What it means now, whether when the hadith was circulating, people knew what harf is and what ahruf meant, or whether it's supposed to be ambiguous and vague, we don't know. Probably if you want, a historical analysis of the word harf starting from pre-Islamic period until the 2nd century Hijrah, 8th century, 9th century, maybe it will shed light on that. But as far as we are concerned, we know that the hadith, the reason why the hadith was circulating is to give legitimacy to the differences in qira'at, and that's it. Now, is it fabricated? I don't know. I don't think so, that it was fabricated at this certain point in time, because there are many variations of this hadith. So I think it was started to be heavily circulating in a specific period of time, which is late, I would say mid 2nd century, which is mid like 700s, 750s, 760s, in a sense, that people started circulating at. And it makes a lot of sense, because this is the period where the qira'at tradition started to take shape, whether the eponymous readings or whether the copying of the masahif. And people started to realize that there are many variations from one codex to another and from one reading to another. So that's one of the problems in the tradition, and that's one of the criticisms against Ibn Mujahid, that he chose 7 readings, making people think that the 7 readings are the sabat ahruf. So there's no correlation whatsoever between the 7 eponymous readings of Ibn Mujahid and or what we'll later on know as the al-qira'at sab'a and the sabat ahruf. So that's one. 2, yes, whether they are 7 or 8 or 9 or 10, any body of readings, any number of readings that Muslim scholars agreed, okay, or established a consensus that these are canonical readings, they are considered to be divine. Now, divine, it means that you can use them in prayers. And again, this is the important criterion. If you use any of the 10 readings in ritual prayer, your prayer is valid. If you choose any reading beyond the 10, your prayer is invalid. So that's the criterion.
So what if
this is the important distinction here is how scholars over the time thought about the readings. Later Muslim scholars thought about the readings as being wahy, as being revelation, or as being validated by the Prophet. The sense that we get from early scholars and early grammarians that they were not considered wahy or revelation. It's a consensus of the readers that they read this or that way.
So does the popularity of the hadith regarding the Sabat Ahruf, the 7 modes, I think, is that you translate as mode? Is that your preferred?
I think Arthur Jeffrey translated it as mode, and I'm just taking his translation, and I chose mode, taking it from him. Yeah.
Okay. So this hadith about the 7 modes in which the Quran was revealed, that they are all divine revelation.
Well, okay. So yes and no. Let's start with the no first. There's no correlation between the 7 readings and the 7 ahruf. Okay.
So we have the term في مصحف أبي, and we have also the term في قراءة أبي, and we have also في حرف أبي. So حرف comes from the 7 ahruf or the سبعة ahruf, and it's also an ambiguous term. We don't know exactly what a harf is. But it is also used. So all these terms, they refer to a qira'ah or a variant reading, be it whether it agrees with the rasm, with the Uthmanic rasm, or it doesn't agree with it. So even in the canonical readings, you would have the same thing. So you would have in early works, في قراءة عاصم, for example, or sometimes في حرف عاصم. They would also use the word harf. They wouldn't use في مصحف عاصم or في مصحف نافع. They would use probably the regional codex, like the Kufan, مصاحف الكوفة or مصاحف المدينة. So the companions, the pre-Uthmanic companions, if you want, they had their own masahif or their own codices, and yes, most of them probably were destroyed, but somehow some of these codices, they survived, or copies of them, and Muslim scholars were using them. They were copying sometimes readings from them. They were still circulating, maybe secretly, or just as tokens or as relics from the past, that some people were keeping them.
Prof, jika bingung soal 7 ahruf, kelihatannya banyak orang bingung juga masalah ini.
It's the aruf. So the aruf is what you are saying your Prophet taught, not the qira'.
What aruf?
Yeah, that's taught, not the qira'.
What aruf?
Yeah, that's.
Oke, kita balik saja ke Khalifah Utsman. Siapakah tim kanonisasi Al-Quran dari Utsman bin Affan? Kemudian apakah artinya Al-Quran yang ada sekarang ini adalah hasil konsensus atau kesepakatan bersama dari ulama-ulama terdahulu?
It's the chicken and the egg, meaning that, okay, Uthman formed a committee. The members of the committee are questionable, historical, okay? Most of them, they were not contemporaries with the Prophet. They were young. They didn't even witness the revelation themselves. They were all 9, 10, 11 years old when they died, when the Prophet died. So they were young. And the senior companions of the Prophet, they were still alive, and they were not part of that committee. So that's one question mark, okay? So the second point is, okay, well, Uthman formed the committee, and they collected the Quran, and the companions, they did not object. There's a silent ijma', okay? So we don't have from the text a statement from the companions that they approved of it.
Yeah, ijma'
means a silent
consensus. Yeah,
consensus. Consensus. So there's a silent consensus that everyone, sure, like Uthman probably showed the copies to all the companions. They didn't object, except for Ibn Mas'ud, who verbally objected to the collection. And if you want indirect objections by Ali bin Abi Talib and by Ubay, because they still have their own codices which disagreed with Uthman's codex. So the point of the egg and chicken is that what Uthman collected, is it the mutawatir divine text revealed to the Prophet and he compiled it? We know that it is. This is the version that was revealed to the Prophet and the companions agreed on it, or he collected something and then there was a consensus later on it, right? Whether it is the revealed text or not, because either case, what matters at the end is consensus in Islamic law. The only thing that people think that the Quran is the most authoritative principle of law or source of law. I mean, it is nominally, but actually the most powerful source of law is consensus. I mean, consensus can even abrogate the Quran itself, and it did. So many of the companions' codices, they are considered to be abrogated. So they were Quran at a certain point, and that's the statement by most early Muslim theologians, that they were Quran at a certain point. The Prophet recited them, the companions recited them, but they were abrogated by Uthman's collection. Okay, so consensus is the most important element here.
Wah, ruwet juga ya Prof ya, kalau semua bisa dibatalkan melalui kesepakatan ya. Nah, namun Prof, kalau melihat ruwetnya sejarah penyusunan Al-Quran seperti yang telah kita bahas tadi, bagaimana korelasi janji ilahi untuk menjaga Al-Quran seperti tersurat dalam Quran surat Al-Hijr ayat 9?
The revelation or the dhikr, again, there's a problem of dhikr, is it the Quran or not? But let's assume it is the Quran. So we have sent the Quran and we are going to protect it. The context of the chapter has nothing to do with textual corruption or with preservation of the Quran. As you mentioned, it has to do with stopping Satan or the devil from interfering in the message. And this theme, if people read early Islamic literature and the whole prophetic mission and the whole struggle between the satanic revelations, or what we call even later the satanic verses, but even the struggle that the Prophet was having with Satan or with the diabolic revelations, they would understand why this verse and other verses were mentioned or revealed. So God is assuring Muhammad that his revelations are not diabolic and they are divine. And you have all the literature in the hadith and the exegetical literature about Gabriel, not you, but the angel Jibril, who's coming down with an escort of angels trying to protect the Quran from Satan shape-shifting into an angel to try to change something in the revelation. And you have other traditions that say, yes, this means that no one is able to change even a letter from the Quran, with a caveat that would change any of its rulings. So early exegetes were more concerned about changes that Satan or devil or anyone possessed by the devil, if you want to extend even that someone who is intently changing something of the Quran, he or she is possessed by the devil, is that they are not going to change anything that would change the meaning. But then exegetes extended that into what they call the textual preservation of the Quran. That this is what theologians and exegetes do. They hold the text and they stretch it.
Pertanyaan terakhir buat Profesor Shady Naseer. Prof, kenapa problem qiraat ini seperti tidak diketahui oleh sebagian besar umat muslim pada umumnya dan baru ramai dibicarakan sekitar 10-15 tahun yang lalu sampai sekarang? Apakah ini merupakan fenomena yang tidak biasa?
Even the internet, the whole discussion of qiraat and readings, it was the majority of Muslims, educated Muslims, not necessarily educated as in Islam as a religion, educated, university educated Muslims, they really didn't know. I mean, I would say 95% of Muslims probably didn't know about the qira'at. People who know about qira'at are only people who took ijazas or had Islamic education, and they understand these things. And even people who are the people who memorize the 7 and the 10 readings are very, very, very few. Now, after the internet, it's a different story. I think there are many official and non-official, if you want, institutes. They are trying to popularize qira'at. There are many recordings now on the internet for the qira'at. People are watching things on YouTube. Reciters who have YouTube channels on reciting in different recitations. So people are slowly getting used to that idea. So I would probably jump from 95% to maybe, I don't know, 60%, 70%, again, anecdotally, thanks to the internet.
Interesting.
It's now even people, they know that there are qira'at, the educated Muslim, they don't know exactly what the differences are, but at least now they know that there's such a thing as qira'at. And now the second stage is they have to get to understand what these qira'at are. And that's, I think, the job of Muslim preachers and people who are leading Muslims in Friday prayers to try to explain to them what these qira'at are from a Muslim perspective, at least, not necessarily from an academic perspective.
Interesting.
Saya akan beralih ke Mbah Marijn Van Putten ya. Kira-kira apakah problem variasi-variasi bacaan dan tulisan dan dalam Quran masih terus terjadi setelah kanonisasi Utsman? Dan apakah bisa dipastikan bahwa varian-varian perbedaan-perbedaan dalam Al-Quran tersebut masih bisa mewakili perkataan Muhammad yang asli?
From, say, the early 8th century. So we're talking about 50 years after the canonization of the Quran, like 80-ish years. So this is about as far back as we can go with traditions. So we certainly said something like that. And at the time that these traditions get recorded, it's clearly about disagreement about what the exact wording of the text actually is. It was really about, the order of words, what the specific wording was. And that really shows where we get into trouble about, what are the exact words of the Quran? Well, clearly there were a bunch of different ways of doing it. And then the question is, is this Uthmanic text, is that the literal words of the Prophet, or the most authentic version of the Prophet? And no, that doesn't. Well, maybe it's the most authentic version of the words of the Prophet, but it's not necessarily the only thing he ever said, or the thing we can say with certainty was the right thing that he said. And
pertanyaan selanjutnya ialah, apakah yang disebut dengan ahruf? Karena tadi Profesor Shady Naseer kelihatan agak bingung dalam menjelaskannya.
Since we're talking about the qira'at, which sometimes get mixed up with ahruf, even within the tradition sometimes. But they're slightly different, but they're related to this, because the question, like I said, it's a kind of worms. So there's this tradition of Muhammad that he revealed the Quran, the Quran was revealed, let's say, or sent down in 7 ahruf. We don't know what that word means. It means edge, it means word, it means letter. Well, 7 letters doesn't make sense, 7 words doesn't make sense, 7 edges doesn't make sense. So everybody's like, well, it probably means something slightly more than that, but who knows exactly what? And we don't know.
Wah, Dr. Marijn Van Putten ternyata juga tidak tahu apa itu yang dimaksud dengan sahabat ahruf ya. Jangan-jangan yang tahu hanya Ustadz nih ya. Oke, pertanyaan selanjutnya adalah bagaimana dengan Quran Sana'a yang dianggap sebagai naskah Al-Quran yang paling tua yang pernah ditemukan? Kemudian, apakah Quran Sana'a bisa dihubungkan dengan peristiwa kanonisasi Al-Quran standar Utsman?
The one exceptional one is DAM 0127.1, or as we usually call it, Sana'a 1, or the Sana'a palimpsest, which is, when you first look at it, a totally boring manuscript, because the text that is written there is just a standard text. However, this is very rare for Quranic manuscripts. The lower text, so it has an original text has been erased and a new text has been written over it. And the lower text is also the Quran, but it's not the same Quran. That is to say, the text isn't the same as the standard Uthmanic text. The differences aren't huge, but there's some important differences. So what do we see? We see that the order of the chapters is different. And we see that some orthographic things are a little bit different, but most importantly, the wording is different. And what you can do, of course, then is you can compare the Uthmani text to the Sejarah palimpsest and do critical, textual criticism and figure out which text is more original. What was the actual wording of the Quran? And once you get that, you sometimes have to admit, yeah, well, not everything that Uthman has is most likely the most original text. That's what you do textual criticism for. You have to figure it out. You have multiple textual witnesses, and it's hard to do with the Quran. Why is it hard to do? Because we only have 2 textual witnesses, right? We don't have 50,000 different copies that we can kind of use, but we have 2, and we have to figure out, well, which one of these 2 is more likely, which is not always easy. Now, there's something else to it, is that this kind of stuff, and one of the reasons why we think of the Sejarah palimpsest, it was clearly intended as a Quran. At the same time, it's important to note that it was erased and the standard text was written over it. Right? So this kind of seems to confirm this destruction narrative to some extent, that Uthman said, get rid of all your silly Qurans, we're going to do one Quran from now on. And that's basically what they did. They got rid of the text and put a new text on top.
Terakhir yang saya akan tanyakan adalah, Al-Quran yang ada sekarang, apakah bisa dipastikan adalah Al-Quran yang sama seperti masa Nabi Muhammad? Kemudian apakah benar klaim-klaim yang sering dinyatakan bahwa Al-Quran terjaga sempurna atau perfectly preserved?
The Quran as we have it goes back to the time of the companions of the Prophet, because Uthman knew the Prophet, so he was a companion of the Prophet. But, that's kind of playing with words. Sure, he's a companion of the Prophet, and sure, he standardized the Quran, but, Muhammad had been dead for, I think, almost 20 years by that time. So, it's not quite the same thing. So arguments for why it goes back to Uthman, I think, are pretty extensive. Only get back to Uthman, right? You only get back to this standardization effort. So I don't know what preservation means. And so some people say perfect preservation. Well, no, it's not perfectly preserved. Even if you open up the Quran today, like more or less word for word, it's the same with Uthman, but some of the spellings are wrong. Now, I would say, I mean, it's clear. I mean, you can look at early manuscripts and some words are spelled differently. Has absolutely no effect on the meaning, but, I mean, if you're going to say perfectly preserved, I mean, is that perfectly preserved? I don't know. If you get the spelling wrong, I mean, that doesn't sound perfectly preserved to me. But, does it matter? No. Now, and, that only brings us back to Uthman. It doesn't bring us back further. And so, yes, after Uthman, he said, this is standard text now. Most people agreed with him. That was very carefully copied. But, is that as well preserved as Muslims claim? I think not, because I think they claim it's word for word.
Ya, sebelum menutup presentase ini, saya akan memberikan slide yang menjadi tambahan. Saya tidak akan menyimpulkan ya, karena saya pikir sudah disimpulkan di presentase yang sebelumnya. Ya, poin-poinnya juga saya sudah berikan, dan saya hanya menyikapi satu slide yang pertama, yaitu masalah 7 ahruf ya. Di sini saya tambahkan sebenarnya ahruf ini memang jadi masalah sampai sekarang ya. Karena juga tidak jelas, waktu dijelaskannya pun juga cara menjelaskannya berbeda-beda, dan memang banyak yang tidak mengerti 7 ahruf ini apakah sama dengan qiraat, apakah berbeda, ya. Kemudian artinya ahruf ini juga tidak jelas. Tadi Dr. Marijn Van Putten juga mengatakan ini tidak jelas. Bahkan Profesor Shady Naseer juga mengatakan bahwa ini ambigu, ya, tidak jelas, nggak tahu seperti apa aslinya, seperti itu ya. Namun yang mengherankan adalah kalau kita melihat dari naskah-naskah, narasi-narasi tradisi yang tersebut adalah bahwa disebutkan bahwa Abu Hurairah melaporkan Nabi mengatakan Al-Quran diturunkan dalam 7 bentuk ya. Ini ada 7 bentuk ya. Kemudian ini juga sumbernya jelas dari Abu Ja'far Muhammad bin Jarir Al-Tabari ya, tafsir volume 1 halaman 22. Kemudian Zuhri juga mendengar bahwa ini adalah 7 bentuk. Bentuk apa? Ini juga tidak jelas ya. Dan mereka hanya mengungkapkan suatu makna tanpa perbedaan pendapat tentang apa yang diperbolehkan dan apa yang dilarang. Ini juga tidak jelas, walaupun ini sumbernya jelas ada di Abu Ja'far juga, Muhammad bin Jarir Al-Tabari ya. Kemudian Ibn Abbas menyatakan bahwa Al-Quran diturunkan dalam 7 dialek. Dialek itu logat bahasa ya. Namun logat bahasa ini apakah betul dialek? Nanti kita akan melihat suatu hadis yang memang ternyata belum tentu dialek ya, karena ada hadis yang sangat-sangat membingungkan kalau saya boleh katakan ya. Nah, padahal 7 dialek yang pada masa abad ke-6 itu ada 7 di sini disebut ya. This dialect were listed as Hudail 1, Kinana 2, KS 3, Daba ya, 4, Taim al-Rabab ya, 5, Asad bin Kuzaimah ya, 6, dan Quraisy ya, 7. Namun kalau kita lihat hadis yang disebutkan di sini, saya tampilkan di layar. Ini dari Abu Ja'far Muhammad bin Jarir Al-Tabari ya. Ini ada suatu cerita yang menarik ya. Pada waktu itu Umar berkata menemukan Hisam bin Hukaim ya. Ini membaca surat salah satu Al-Furqan gitu ya. Namun bacaannya berbeda dengan yang dihafalkan oleh Umar. Kemudian Umar marah dan dia menyeret si Hisam ini di depan Nabi gitu. Kemudian dia mengatakan bahwa ini kamu bohong karena Nabi nggak pernah mengajari yang versi bacaan seperti itu ya. Namun Nabi juga membela, kemudian menyuruh membaca ya Hisam ya. Kemudian Umar juga disuruh membaca ya. Kemudian Nabi mengatakan bahwa dua-duanya benar lah gitu ya. Begitulah diturunkan katanya. Ya. Dia juga mengatakan bahwa Al-Quran ini diturunkan dalam 7 bentuk. Maka bacalah yang paling mudah ya, seperti itu. Nah, kalau kita melihat 7 dialek ini juga bertentangan karena Umar dan Hisam ini satu suku ya. satu suku, Anda lihat nih, satu suku ya. Keduanya sama-sama suku Quraisy ya. Nah, tidak mungkin terjadi beda dialek ya. Memang ini 7 kebingungan kalau saya boleh bilang ya. Memang tidak jelas ahruf ini bentuknya seperti apa, seperti itu ya. Jelas ya? Ya, terakhir, slide terakhir ya. Saya akan membahas masalah apakah mushaf Al-Qur'an lengkap ya. Ini suka sering diklaim ya bahwa Al-Qur'an adalah lengkap, komplit begitu ya. Nah, saya tidak mengandai-andai, bukan kata saya, bukan fitnah ya. Saya hanya mengambil dua hadis dari Jalal Al-Din Abdurrahman ya. Ini tertulis ya bahwa itu Umar dikabarkan berkata bahwa jangan ada di antara kalian mengatakan bahwa aku telah mendapatkan seluruh Al-Quran ya. Bagaimana dia tahu apa semua itu? Sebagian besar Al-Quran telah hilang ya. Ini Umar yang berkata ya. Sebaliknya, biarkanlah dia berkata, saya mendapatkan apa yang bertahan atau tersisa. Nah ini, kalau kita bilang lengkap, saya pikir dengan hadis ini menunjukkan memang tidak lengkap secara fisik ya. Secara historis ya. Secara historis memang tidak lengkap. Kemudian kalau kita lihat hadis yang satu lagi, yaitu beberapa dari kami bertemu untuk bertukar laporan hadis ya. Seorang sahabat berkata, cukup ini, lihat kitab Allah gitu ya. Imran bin Husain berkata, kamu bodoh katanya ya. Apakah Anda menemukan dalam Alkitab Allah, Al-Quran, doa-doa yang menjelaskan atau doa-doa yang dijelaskan secara rinci atau puasa? Nah, Al-Quran menyebut mereka secara umum saja katanya. Sunnahlah, hadislah yang memberikan penjelasan rinci atau detail. Nah, ini kita lihat ya, kalau disebut lengkap secara teologis juga tidak. Karena memang Al-Quran tidak bisa berdiri sendiri tanpa hadis. Jadi Al-Quran memang harus diterjemahkan melalui sunnah hadis Nabi. Seperti itu. Ya, ini jelas. Jadi secara historis memang tidak lengkap. Secara teologis pun juga tidak lengkap. Karena Al-Quran tidak bisa berdiri sendiri dan harus dijelaskan melalui hadis maupun tafsir.